And now we can start the show. Shortbox Nation, without further ado, let's welcome your favorite comic writer's favorite comic writer. It's Joe Casey. Hey, Joe, how are you doing today?
All right, how are you, man?
I am out of breath now. Trying to name all your accolades is a Herculean feat right there.
Well, it made me want to take a nap. I know that. A lot of work.
Joe, I mean, yeah, it is, man. You had a lot of work, and I got to say, I was going through your bibliography and your list of works, and you've got there's quite a few on there that I'm both familiar with and a big fan of. Specifically, the series that come to mind is you did a Iron Man run, a limited run in 2007 called Enter the Mandarin with his name was it Eric Canet? Canet? How do you say it?
Eric Canetti.
Yeah, Canetti. I love that series, and I think I can pinpoint that limited run as being a catalyst for me getting really into Iron Man. And if I'm not mistaken, I think 2007 was around the same time that the Iron Man MCU film, whether it was the first one or second one, around that time, like the movie was coming out. So I was actually rereading that Iron Man series the other night, and I'm like, this shit still holds up.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, that series exists because it was predating the movie, but we knew the movie was happening. And at that time, early in its development, the Mandarin was going to be at least alluded to a lot more strongly. So they wanted to have material that laid some track for that character, maybe a little bit more modern or a little more of an update than the old 60s version. So
Yeah, and
that's why that series exists.
I mean, it's a great little, I think it's like 5 issues, so, like, not a long commitment, but drawn wonderfully. I didn't even, like, notice at the time, but, like, Dave Stewart is doing the colors, so,
Yeah.
it's like the art looks great, the colors look great, the story's got, like, this cool kinda pulpy noir, a lot of action, and you really get to see, like, Iron Man, like I guess what I appreciate about it is that it wasn't like this it wasn't like repurposing like the classic, Iron Man's an alcoholic trope going on. It was like, here's Iron Man fighting the Mandarin for the first time, and like he's getting his ass kicked, and he's really having to like he's meeting like a formidable foe, and you like worked in like world politics into the story in a way that wasn't like boring to a at the time 18-year-old kid.
Well, that's good. I mean that series was also based on some of the old '60s stories. We sort of adapted them as you would adapting a book to a film in a way, and you update things and you recontextualize things, and I like doing that kind of stuff. And that one turned out really well, mainly because Eric Canetti's art was so distinctive, and like you say, Dave Stewart's coloring was fantastic too.
Yeah, highly recommend. I guess for any listeners out there, if you can get a hold of this 2007 run, Iron Man Enter the Mandarin, it is well worth whatever the price of admission is. I think you can find it pretty cheap on secondhand.
Sure.
Joe, speaking of which, like I said, I went down kind of a rabbit hole of all the different stuff you've worked on, and I tried to find like what was the earliest because we're talking about like I said in the intro, like a 2 decade, 2 decade plus at this point career. And I found your Wikipedia page, and tell me if this is accurate. I know a lot of times, info on Wikipedia can either be outdated or just incorrect. But
Yeah.
it's got your earliest work listed. Some of your early work is like some fanzine essays that you wrote. One in particular, I was trying to find. You wrote something called a San Diego Comic Con program ad. It was like the story. Do you remember what it's called? I can't recall off the top of my head right now.
Something like it was a takeoff on I was a teenage something or other. It was like I was
Yes. All right.
almost a
I
teenage
just found
comic
it.
book writer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I could have been a teenage comic book writer.
Yeah.
Essay in the San Diego Comic Con convention program from 1995. So that's one of the earliest works Wikipedia has listed. And then another one is The Harvest King. It's a 3-issue miniseries from Caliber Comics from 1998. And then it says that your first kind of major big breakthrough with like a large major publisher. It's got listed Wolverine Days of Future Past issues 2 and 3, script by Joe Casey, story by John Francis Moore, with art by Joe Bennett. Does that ring a bell? And is that accurate? Would you say like that was your first kind of like big, a big entrance into, big publisher comics and all that?
It's semi accurate. What happened was I got the gig writing Cable first, and but
Okay.
I had some lead time on that because the artist was trying to catch up, and there was some scheduling things. So I was working on that on issues that had not been published yet. But in that, while we were getting going on that series, the Wolverine miniseries was way behind, and John Francis Moore didn't have time to script it. So, in one of those classic, you're a new writer, let's test your metal situations, they sent me the pencils for the second issue and said, "Can you script this in, I think it was 2 days?" And I said, "Yes," because that's what you say when you're breaking in and you're trying to get work and you're trying to
Yeah, right.
impress. And so I
Whatever
scripted it
you
in
got,
2 days. Yeah. So
wow.
it turned out okay, and so yeah, so that was published first, but I actually had the cable gig prior to that. Just that my run didn't start seeing print until I think maybe January of 1998. So yeah, the Wolverine work predates it publication wise, but not in the order that I was doing it.
Okay. And I guess at that point, like, where did you learn to like script or write a script and writing in general? Did you go to school for it? Did you have any, I guess, like classic, were you classically educationally trained?
Not at all. I'm completely self taught. I mean, I was a big fan of comic books and the business of comic books growing up. And in the 80s, we were really lucky. We had a lot of really professional level fanzines they were being put out. This was pre Wizard magazine, and this was like Amazing Heroes, Comics Interview. The Comics Journal was in its publication prime, and it was these fanzines were really a great look behind the curtain. And occasionally, they would get into process and especially writer's process, and on the rare occasion they would actually reprint a script page, like an actual script page. From I remember one of the earliest ones I saw was from Denny O'Neil, and just seeing the format was enough to sort of unlock it in my brain. It's like, okay, now I know. Because before that, I was doing what everybody who wants to do comics when they're a kid does. I was writing and drawing my own comics. Not very well, but that was how I was trying to learn. That was what I was trying. Everybody wants to be an artist when they start out. And then at some point I realized, well, I'm just not that good of an artist and I never will be. And I was really more interested in the storytelling aspect of it than I was the art aspect, even though I love comic book art, obviously. But it was the dialogue, it was the stories, it was the plots, it was the characters that I was really into. So that's I transitioned into writing. And so when you do that, you start to look around and how do I do it? What's the process? What's the format? So I've just here and there just get little tidbits and start to formulate my own style, my own approach. And 10 years later, I broke into the business as a professional.
Growing up, did you have comic books in the house? Like, can you recall what's the earliest conscious memory of a comic book that you have?
It's the classic story of like my earliest memories, like being on a road trip with my parents when I was 5 years old, and they bought me something out of the, or I asked for it or whatever. I saw it in the spinner rack in the gas station or the convenience store that we'd stopped at, and I had begged a parent to spend the quarter that it cost, and then you're in the back seat with this thing, and I had known about. I think it was probably a Spider. It was actually a Spider-Man reprint from the '60s or the late '60s that they were reprinting a lot of Spider-Man material in the '70s because he was their most popular character. And it's one of those things where you know you just see something and you have that instant connection. It's the classic thing about Mozart saw the piano and he just knew how to play it. And it was just a situation where I understood it. I understood the language of it. I understood what it was trying to convey. Some people go their whole lives. I know adults who don't know how to read comics. They don't know how to, what comes first? Where do I look at first? What do I read first? Which direction do I go in? So I guess it's and I just got the language from the get go, from being 5 years old, and just was fascinated and just deep into it. It's been the longest relationship of my life. These comic books. So I love them from being a kid. I wanted to do them from an early age, and I've never lost the fascination.
I guess, like, just still thinking about, like, I guess, still on the topic of this kind of career retrospect. And I didn't mean to like get so deep so early
No,
into the interview. We're just getting to know each other, but I just did the math in my head. If we're looking at that, that cable series you said was like what you consider your first kind of like breakthrough into the larger industry, 98, let's just call it. That's 27 years now.
Yeah.
I guess would you describe yourself as a veteran in this industry? Like, is there anyone that you look up to in this industry as inspiration, or you consider like a colleague on equal footing?
Well, I mean, my colleagues, I work with my colleagues, whether they're the artists that I work with or my partners in Man of Action. I mean, in terms of, the term veteran, it's funny. I equate the term veteran with having been like a soldier in war, you know. So for anybody in comics call themselves a veteran, we fight our own wars, but they're certainly not on the level that real people do, real soldiers do. So veteran is a weird word. I'm proud that I've lasted this long, and I'm proud of the experiences I've had, and that I'm still in there swinging, and I'm still not, and that I didn't burn out. That was kind of, that wasn't really a concern, but it's happened to other creators. They've burnt out and lost their mojo, and I never seem to. So that's it's a blessing that I'm still just as excited about the medium and the art form, and even the industry, as messed up as it is. I'm still happy to be a part of it. I haven't thrown my hands up in disgust and walked away yet because I was frustrated with how the business is run or things like that. I'm still in there trying to do my best work and trying to maneuver the industry, whatever the situation is.
Yeah, I mean, I just listed off like three, monthly titles that you're that you're currently writing. I'd say that, I, I guess saying that, like, is the process that you have now when it comes to writing your scripts and working your projects, is it how different is it from like say 1998 or some middle point? Like how much of it has your process evolved? I know like in terms of like the industry that has definitely evolved since 98 in terms of marketing and everything that goes into it, but just looking at your writing process and your creative process, how much of it has changed like throughout the years? Are there any, I guess, tentpole moments that, kind of changed the way you approach, writing?
Well, I think when I first started, every gig was really like the gig of my lifetime. I had put so much pressure on myself because I didn't know how long it was going to last. When I started my run on cable, I didn't know if I would last 12 issues or 2 issues. When you're brand new, you're just kind of waiting for them to bring the hook out and like it's like yank you off stage. So every issue, every page, every panel was like precious to me. It had to be just right and just so. And that also had to do with whatever insecurity I was holding is, do I have the talent to do this? Do I have the gift to do this or the means to do this? I was ready to work my ass off to do it, but there's got to be some talent in there somewhere, hopefully. And as I've gone on, I put less pressure on myself, and I've gotten better at the job. I mean, you can't do something for 27 years and not get better at it. So, I still put a lot of pressure on myself to be as good as I can be, but I don't have the pressure of every gig being the be all end all. This is it's going to make or break me kind of thing, which is nice because that was hard pressure to put on myself at my mid
Yeah.
20s. But
I guess.
no, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna sorry to interrupt. I was gonna jump in because you said something that triggered something. That got me thinking. Like at that age or in that phase of your period, starting out, like aside from looking internally, like what external factors are you looking at to get like that confirmation or that confidence boost that you're on the right track? I mean, is it sale numbers? Is it like approval or compliments from other peers and colleagues? Like where were you looking towards to like kind of refine, your skills and just build your confidence.
Well, I mean, in terms of building my skills, I just wanted to keep doing it, and I would have kept doing it no matter what. But in terms of like career wise, there was a Marvel Creative Summit that happened probably about 7 months after I broke in that I went to. It was held on the East Coast. And from that summit, I met a lot of the other editors at Marvel. And from meeting them, I got a couple of gigs here, like an annual, one shot here or there. once that happened, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm going to be here for a little while. And that kind of alleviated the pressure of, will this be a career, or just like, will I be in this for a year and then flame out? Um, so that was an important part of like the next step of being a professional in the business. And it wasn't just one gig, one shot, and it's over. So that was
Mhm.
a big deal.
If if I was to ask your editors, the previous editors that you've worked with, or even collaborators, artists, etc., what what strengths you have, or what do you think your previous editors or collaborators would say about you in terms of like your work ethic or what you bring to the table creatively?
I that's a good question. Um, I'd like to think my work ethic is pretty strong. It's the one thing, like I said, I felt like I didn't know for a long time, to this day you still question it, how much raw talent you might have at something. But if you can recognize that, hey, maybe I don't have the most talent, or I don't have the God given gift. Maybe I can work harder than everybody else, and that can compensate for whatever uh, wherever I'm lacking in the talent department. So I was very, very adamant on busting my ass to get in, to stay in, to be in it for the long haul. And to this day, I still have that attitude, because it's the one thing that you can control, is how hard you work at something. Everything else is sort of up to chance or up to fate or whatever. You can't control how people think of you when they're not staring you in the face. You can't control how an audience will embrace your work, but you can control how hard you work. And so that's kind of been my ethos. So I hope my collaborators recognize that, because you know I ask a lot of my collaborators very often, but I wouldn't do it if I wasn't there myself 110%. I'd never ask like a collaborator to do more than I was willing to do. That just seems not right and unfair and lazy. So that's been my metric for the most part.
And I guess this might be an unfair question, but I guess when you think back on what did we say, almost 27 years of working in comics, does any one, and maybe not memorable, whatever, one or two, whatever comes to mind, what are some of like the most memorable moments in terms of like feeling like you achieved, great success, whether that was financially or, accolades, etc. Like, are there any moments that immediately come to mind that you're like, man, that was like an epic moment for me in my career that, filled me with pride, that let me know I was on the right track?
I think all of that stuff is I look at it as accomplishments in retrospect. Like at the time you're just kind of doing it and trying to hang on, but when I look back and think about the fact that I was writing uh, X-Men and Superman simultaneously at both of the big two companies, I don't think anybody had ever done that before. At the time, I was like just doing my work, doing the best work that I could, and just trying to stay in the game. I look back and I'm like, that's pretty impressive. Not many people, nobody could have claimed it at the time, and people have done it since, I think. But I look back and I feel like that was kind of an interesting situation that I was in. The other thing is, again, in retrospect, the amount of creator-owned work I've been able to get out into the world that has really been true to the vision that I had when I thought of them. To be able to go from soup to nuts on projects. I mean, at Image Comics, I think I've done, I don't know, 15, 20 creator owned series over the years. And that's a lot of work to do that is really reflective of your vision. It's a non-compromised vision that you got out into the world in pretty much exactly the way you wanted it to. That I'm pretty proud of that, and that's a big deal. I don't take that for granted to this day, because it's one thing to get a job, writing Spider-Man or whatever. It's another thing that, if you love comics, to build something from ground zero to published product. You're not part of an assembly line. You're shepherding the whole thing. It's enormously satisfying. It's creatively fulfilling, and I've had the chance to do it at Image Comics. Like I said, 15, 20 times so far. That's really been important to me as I look back on it.
Yeah, I love the way you phrase that, because I've heard from many, creators that I've had on that speak to, the I guess the misconception is the word that comes to mind when it comes to like, when it comes to like working like for like the big two on like some established superhero or IP versus like your indie stuff. A lot of folks think that maybe the working the self creator owned stuff is a little easier because you have all that control. But the trade off is that like you have to, from like you said, from like soup to nuts, like everything, like you're thinking about the world you're creating, the character, what are they like? You don't have anything to base. You don't have like a solid foundation, like say writing a Spider-Man that comes with years of continuity plus like a built-in fan base, the machine behind it. So I really enjoy, I like hearing that, you take pride in that creator-owned work. And I guess, just thinking about your creator-owned series, which, just, right now you're writing like Blood Squad 7 for Image Comics. You had a long stint for Image writing your creator-owned series Sex. And then on top of a whole Godland comes to mind as well. But what I want to know is if you were to recommend one series, a creator-owned series that you wrote that you feel perfectly maybe encapsulates your vision and your voice to recommend to someone that's like, man, I want to get into Joe Casey. Like, what does he got over here in this creator-owned stuff? Like, what comes to mind for you?
Well, it's like, who's your favorite child? It's like it's a tough thing to answer.
Yeah, I
Um,
know that's the question right there.
because as soon as I think of something, I go, well, but what about, or what about this, or what about that? I mean, I could
Sure.
list,
I mean,
you know,
obviously this could change like any day of the week, but like right now, what jumped out at you?
well, I mean, before Blood Squad 7, the last creator-owned series I did was a limited series called Junior Baker, the Righteous Faker, which was a sort of a spiritual sequel to a book I'd done a decade earlier called Butcher Baker, the Righteous Maker. Now, Butcher Baker I put up as it was drawn by Mike Huddleston. Looked great. It is a really good gonzo superhero subversive story. I'm really proud of it. Junior Baker, the sequel, was much more personal, much more plugged into my own life or what I'd kind of experienced in the, you know, decade plus years that I did Butcher Baker, which was it was very wild and gonzo and over the top. Whereas Junior Baker was a little more meditative, spoke a little bit more to my life as I live it now. And and it was drawn by a great artist, new artist named Ryan Quackenbush. It was fully, sort of media painted the whole thing. And it was really a personal story that I was telling about a guy kind of assessing his place in the world in relation to superheroes and fatherhood and all these subjects that were very close to my own life, and I'd never really expressed them in a comic before. So I would say if I had to choose one to point people to, it'd be that one because it's the closest to me personally at this point. So that's what I would pick.
No, I'll check that out myself. And I guess on that topic, Joe, I what are you doing when you're not writing comics? Because I mean, like it's such a big part of your life, and then on top of like working in animation and writing all the stuff you do with Man of Action Entertainment, like I guess when you're not writing comics or writing a script, like what do you like to do? What are some of your like non-comic hobbies?
Well, I'm kind of lucky that I turned my hobby into my career. So I get to do what I love to do all the time for a living. So there's not a lot of downtime. I mean, I'm co-parenting, raising two kids, and so obviously that takes up a lot of time. Um, and just sort of maintaining your life as an adult is a task in and of itself. So
Yeah,
you
and that is true.
know when I'm not writing or, I mean, I'm doing sort of the normal things that people do, go to the movies, go out and just hang out with friends and stuff. But I don't have another thing that I go to sort of escape from, my work or my life because I've busted my ass to have a life that I want to be in. So I'm in no hurry to not be in it. You know what I mean? And if I have downtime, I look at it as an opportunity to sort of be creative in a non-deadline environment. In other words, something that I can really let my mind go and think of things that aren't due in a month or due in a week or due in 2 months. You know, you can let the ideas flow. And so I get, in a way, it's kind of twisted as it sounds. That is my hobby now, is to have ideas that are not um, demanding to be executed at that moment, to let ideas percolate and to sort of muse over things and to really let things uh, you know soak in the mystery box for a while. uh,
Yeah.
I get a big kick out of still being able to do that.
Wow. That phrase comes to mind right now. What do they say? If you're doing something you love, you never work a day in your life.
Absolutely. I listen, I'd heard that when I was really young, and I thought, if that's true, then I'm gonna make sure that's how I live my life. Because
Oh yeah.
before I broke into comics, I had menial jobs and 9 to 5 gigs, and I just, if that had been my life, I don't know. I mean, I would have been doing comics regardless on the side, or and done them whichever way I could do them just to express myself. But I'm damn glad I was able to do it as a career and just devote all of my energy towards it, as opposed to having to divide my energy between a job I didn't want and the hobby that I loved.
Look, Joe, as a lifelong comic fan, I'm glad that you are in this industry doing what you do best, man.
Thanks.
Um, with that being said, I want to turn the corner and get to talking about the reason why you're here on the pod today, which is the upcoming Space Ghost Jonny Quest Space Quest series. Say that like 5 times. That's a good little tongue twister there. Which
Right.
comes out yeah, issue one hits comic shops March 26th. And this is combining the world of the current. Well, I don't think. Well, I'll let you correct me, but it's combining the world of Space Ghost and Jonny Quest, which you are the writer for the current Jonny Quest series that is currently coming out through Dynamite, along with artist Sebastian Perez. How do you say his last name? Perez.
Here is.
Here is okay. So you two are not only going to be doing the Jonny Quest series, but you're also going to be doing this new Space Quest series. For anyone that might not be familiar, I want to read the solicitation for the Space Quest series,
Well,
and then Joe, Joe, I want you to chime in with anything that you feel like you want to add to it that maybe reflects your vision of what readers can expect.
okay.
Okay, so here's what they got for the solicitation. At last, the meeting the cosmos demanded. The Quest family is legendary for how far they'll go in the spirit of exploration and discovery. But now they're headed for outer space. Johnny and the gang are brought in to investigate a mysterious, potentially alien spacecraft being held at Area 51. And where there's a spaceship, there's bound to be aliens, right? What happens when Space Ghost and Johnny Quest cross paths? The greatest entertainment event of the 21st century. That's what. Brought to you by acclaimed creative team of Jonny Quest. Now, Joe, hearing that, I guess one of my most immediate question is, what connection did you find between these two concepts, whether that be like creatively or the way they're constructed, and how are you bridging, I guess, the world of Jonny Quest and Space Ghost together?
Well, it's interesting because this whole story was originally going to be, I mean, in my mind, it was going to be the second arc of the Jonny Quest series that I was writing already. But the guys at Dynamite figured, well, this is a bigger event than that, and let's put the spot on it, which is fine. But I would say that the reason I wanted to do it, I mean, I'm a fan of both characters and both concepts, obviously. But if you look at them side by side, there are a lot of similarities. There with each concept, there is um, sort of an adult figure that's a very action oriented figure. In the case of Jonny Quest, it's Race Bannon, and in Space Ghost, it's Space Ghost himself. Then there is the two teenagers that hang around. There's In Jonny Quest, it's Johnny and Haji. For Space Ghost, it's Jan and Jace. And they also both have little pets that they run around with. In Jonny Quest case, it's Bandit, and for Space Ghost, it's Blip. So, you see those similarities and you think, okay, how can we mix it up so that you're crossing over the concepts in a way that makes sense, uh, and sort of is still true to both concepts. And it's the fact is, as far as I know, no one's ever done this before. No one's ever had this thought that if you switched out certain elements, the concepts would still basically be the same in terms of how they look in formation, how they look on paper. So to come up with a story to facilitate that sort of switch up was my whole motivation. And it's not really a big secret now because some of the covers for number 2 have been seen, where you see Johnny and Haji in the Jan and Jace sort of Space Ghost apprentice uniforms. So
Whoa! I'm actually looking at it right now, and
yeah,
it is. I mean, it's Mark Spears did the cover, so it's already like amazing. But this is a
yeah.
really cool concept.
Well, yeah. So that's just something I wanted to see. I wanted to see that myself. So this coming up with the story to make that happen was kind of my whole motivation. Is how do I trade those two teenage duos, and how would that story play out? How would that work? How would the dynamic work if Space Ghost's sidekicks were Johnny and Haji, and how would it work if Dr. Quest's children were Jan and Jace? So that was my commercial motivation for doing. And then of course once you start to think of the story, the character motivations and the relationships and the action stuff, and that all starts to come into focus. And then as it turned out, it's more than just a gimmick. It's turned out to be a really fun and resonant story that I think illuminates those characters to some degree.
Well, I mean, I'm sold. I kind of feel like they should have used that as the solicitation. But
Well, yeah.
I got a scenario for you here. Take me for example. I am currently collecting the current Space Ghost series by David Pepose and Jonathan Lau, which is awesome. I mean, it was like one of my favorite comic. I said it was like one of the best comic books of last year. It's an awesome, fun, action-packed series. I think Space Ghost, Jane and Jace, in the hands of David Pepose have been, kind of really cool to see like reinvented. But I read the free comic book day issue of Jonny Quest, loved it. I'm kind of behind on the main series. So let's take someone like me that is currently reading Space Ghost, or even vice versa. Let's say someone is currently reading your Jonny Quest run, but isn't reading Space Ghost. I guess are they going to be able to follow along with Space Quest just fine without having to do a lot of like catch up and homework?
Yes. I mean, the Space Ghost side of the series does not really tie into what they're doing on the monthly series, because they're doing a whole macro story there. And it's one of my sort of tenets as a writer. I don't want to mess with somebody else's story if I can help it. So this really stands alone as an event series that it's informed by how they're doing Space Ghost over there, because I like that consistency, and they're doing a classic Space Ghost, so it's not altogether different from the episodes of the classic episodes of the cartoon show from the '60s either. So I think, we do our best to make it. If somebody's coming to this cold, don't know anything about Jonny Quest or Space Ghost, it's all in that first issue to catch you up and get you up to speed on the concepts and the character dynamics, really.
Now, I saw in a different interview where you were talking about. Well, I'm sorry. Let me take a step back. You brought up the cartoons, the classic Hanna-Barbera cartoons of Space Ghost and Jonny Quest, which I remember watching, on VHS thanks to my dad as a kid, and I definitely was huge into the old Space Ghost cartoons. But you've said in a separate interview that the creators of those two, Alex Toth for Space Ghost and Doug Wildey for Jonny Quest, are considered comic book royalty. And as someone that, works in animation and you've, worked on scripts and et cetera for a bunch of shows, I guess can you talk a little more about that type of praise that you give like Doug Wildey and Alex Toth? Like how are their spirits? I guess are we going to see any of their, I want to say spirits in this series, but that sounds kind of weird. But you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I'm a fan of both of those shows too. So I'd like to think that, I'm if you for any readers who are a fan of those shows, I'm delivering the goods. The voices are there, the character dynamics are there. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here with either one of these concepts. Um, but the thing about Space Ghost and Jonny Quest as cartoons, even more so than the superhero cartoons that we got in the 70s and the 80s, those two series look like comic book art. They're not simplified that much for the animation process. Later on, when you see things like the Super Friends or even the Spider-Man show from the 60s, they had to kind of uh, pick their battles in terms of what they could show based on production schedules and just intricacies. I mean, it's sort of the charm of like the old Spider-Man 60s show that they only did the webbing very often from just the head, and the body would just be solid red because it's too hard to animate that figure with all the webbing design on there. So, but Jonny Quest in particular, especially like the opening credits and stuff, it really looked like world-class comic book art brought to life in animation. And if you were a comic book fan, which I was, like I said, since I was 5 years old, and you looked at Jonny Quest, you'd go, "That's like a comic book being animated." When you looked at the Super Friends, you're kind of into it, but it was sort of you realize that, hey, this is great. It's great to have Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and those characters in a cartoon, but it doesn't look like Neil Adams drew it. It doesn't look like George Perez drew it. Jonny Quest and Space Ghost have the Doug Wildey, Alex Toth style to them, and they're great comic book artists. So the fact that they're able to translate that pretty accurately into animation makes them leagues beyond most other comic book animation until around until probably around the X-Men cartoon in the early 90s,
Yeah.
or the Batman animated series in the early 90s. I mean, those were finally the shows where I could look at them and go, all right, these are comparable to the comic book art that you find in the best comics, especially Batman. I mean, with X-Men, the art was okay, but the stories were deep, and they really went to continuity of the comic book. So it made up for it in that respect. But before that, it was Space Ghost and Jonny Quest were that benchmark for me.
Well said. What would you say is harder, personally speaking, for you? Do you prefer, or I guess, do you prefer more, or which one do you prefer more, writing for comics or animation? And then I guess if you don't mind explaining, like, what's that Venn diagram between the two art forms look like in terms coming from a writer's perspective?
I mean, look. Well, first of all, it's comic books all the way. That's my first love. It's my great love. It's my best love. There will never be another, as far as I'm concerned. Animation. It's funny because more often than not now, we're trying to take from comic books more than we ever have in terms of, when I write a script for animation, I want it to deliver as a single unit of entertainment, like the best comic books I read as a kid. Before people were writing for the trade and people were writing these sort of multi-part stories where you'd get something that was so satisfying between the covers that you had in your hand, as opposed to part 2 of 6 or whatever. I mean, that's okay for what it is, but I think as an industry, we haven't done ourselves any favors by not delivering the goods every single issue. Some issues are admittedly filler issues because you're trying to get to the next thing or whatever. And animation, I find, is much more like those old comics. Is that every episode you want to be a killer, you want to deliver on every level, and have it be packed full of action, suspense, emotion, character, all that stuff. So to me, that's where the Venn diagram crosses over. Is just as a unit of entertainment, you want to just deliver on all fronts with those both of those things.
And shameless plug here on your behalf here, Joe. Speaking about writing for trades, it turns out the first volume of your Johnny Quest series for Dynamite, that first trade is coming out the same day as Space Quest. So if you want to catch up with Johnny Quest before getting the Space Quest, you could do so on the same day.
I
Uh,
would recommend it because like I said, it's really, and especially in the Johnny Quest side of things, it's the Space Quest series is a continuation of what we did in the Johnny Quest series. So if you really want the whole story, you should definitely get the trade.
and pick up Space Ghost while you're at it. But on the topic, back to Space Quest, uh, if I didn't mention, I apologize. But your artist, your collaborator, Sebastian Perez, I hope I'm saying that right. Sebastian Perez is also the artist for the Space Quest series, and I was curious to hear from you. Um, and since this is an audio first show, how would you verbally describe Sebastian's art style? And I guess what's the energy like between you, like now moving into working on a second series and incorporating more cast members and more characters? Like, does the process or relationship change at all? Like, also tackling Space Quest?
Well, when I found Sebastian to do the Johnny Quest series, I felt a big relief because I knew that he could really evoke the old cartoon, but without being a slave to the old style. He brings his own thing to it, but you recognize it as Johnny Quest. So he did that so well. I had no doubts about his Space Ghost depiction. I'll tell you this, I've said this before. There are three artists that I think depicted Space Ghost the best in comics. And that's Alex Toth, Steve Rude, who did a Space Ghost one shot in the late 80s for Comico, and Alex Ross, who did the covers of a Space Ghost series that my partner Joe Kelly did at DC in the mid aughts, I think.
I think those might have been for. It wasn't for Future Quest, right? I think it
No,
was the
no,
series before that.
this is for DC before Future Quest.
Okay, okay.
So those are my three goats for drawing for Space Ghost artwork. Sebastian is now right up there in that company. I feel like his Space Ghost is so amazing and just so right on that because Space Ghost is tough to get right. And we've seen a lot of Space Ghost depicted on all of the variant covers of the various issues of the monthly that Dynamite puts out. And for my money, there's pitfalls to drawing Space Ghost. That white unitard is a minefield for artists. It's really tough to pull that off in a way that makes you go, yeah, that's Space Ghost. And Sebastian does it. It's beautiful what he does with Space Ghost.
I can't wait to check it out. I've heard Space Ghost described, especially like characters that have like kind of a quote unquote simple, costume design as being deceptively easy.
Yeah,
Deceptively hard. It looks easy. You're like, oh, it's just a white leotard. How hard could it be? But to actually like draw it in motion and evoke certain emotions and actions like is actually rather difficult.
yeah. It's a big deal because when it's wrong, it just kind of it's hard to look at, to be honest. So the fact that Sebastian nails it is like a huge relief. But I knew he would. I knew he would. He's
Yeah.
that great.
Awesome. Joe, you brought up Space Ghost depicted in other forms of media, and I think we'd be remiss not to mention that we're recording this interview just a couple of days after it was sadly announced that George Lowe passed away. George Lowe being the veteran voice actor and comedian, best known for voicing Space Ghost in the Space Ghost Coast to Coast series, along with of many other shows as well. I just kind of want to, give a nod to George here, but
Yeah.
I guess were you a fan of Space Ghost Coast to Coast? Did that show inform anything in this new series that you're writing?
Well, I mean, the thing was when that was really running strong on Cartoon Network, I was I didn't have cable TV. I was in my poor period. So I knew about it, and I would see it occasionally when I was, like a friend's house who happened to have cable. And I thought it was a genius show. Because, I didn't have, I loved Space Ghost as a kid, but I didn't have so much of a connection to it that I felt like, oh my God, this is some kind of desecration. Thought it was brilliant. Thought it was, a great way to bring that character back into the public consciousness. And, that's the true test of a great character is they can survive different iterations. They can survive different treatments. Batman is the same way. There's the 60s, pop art show, and there's the Christopher Nolan Deadly Serious movie series, and the character is strong enough to take both of those extreme interpretations and without breaking a sweat. And with Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Space Ghost proved he was on that level because it doesn't diminish anybody's appreciation for how cool that character is. It just proves that he was built to last and he was built with real resilience. Because believe me, there are cartoon characters that if you put them in that different of a context, they totally fall apart. They can't stand up to it. And Space Ghost does definitely.
Yeah, I had David Pepos on the show last year or a couple months ago to promote his Space Ghost series, and we talked a lot about Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and I went down like a rabbit hole of just watching like just clips on YouTube, and man, you're right, that show was really ahead of its time. I remember as a kid it would come on it would come on Cartoon Network or Adult Swim, and I was just kind of detached from it because they were just talking, so there was
Yeah.
no action or anything. So I definitely didn't appreciate it, as a kid, a young teenager. But looking back now, man, some of those interviews, like it would fit so well in today's kind of pop culture, right? Where, it seems like everyone's got a podcast or a talk show. But man, watching those old clips, they still hold up really strong. So I just wanted to just to honor George Lowe
Yeah, definitely.
here. And I guess speaking on a related note, kind of speaking about depictions and animated versions and live action versions, uh, I am curious. You are. I said in the intro that you are the creator of America Chavez, who was recently, who was recently adapted in live action in the Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness movie by actress Xochitl Gomez. I guess just kind of curious your thoughts about seeing, this character that you and Nick Dragata created in 2001, fast forward, 2023 or 22, whenever the movie came out, seeing it on live action, depicted in real life. How'd that make you feel?
Well, I got to tell you, I have mixed emotions about it. On the one hand, I'm really proud that character transcended the comic book page and made it into the MCU because I love a lot of those movies, so it gives me a lot of pride on that level. I'm proud that the character exists in general because you know in a in a shared universe that was mostly white male centric. Uh, Characters like that were needed, so I'm glad that we're able to contribute and that she has stood the test of time. My mixed emotions about it are that we're still in the very, I guess, the dark ages when it comes to creator recognition and compensation, and when it comes to these corporate IPs.
I imagine.
And so, on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, it sort of puts a light on an issue that has not yet been resolved, and I don't know if we're any closer to resolving it. But it is what it is, and those of us who are sort of in the trenches, we're doing what we can to change that system. But it's a very David and Goliath kind of situation. So uh, I feel like it's going to take a lot of years, a lot of effort to really turn that ship in the right direction.
How did you go about creating the character America Chavez? Like, what was the, I guess, like inception of the character? Because to your point, for anyone that might not know, like America Chavez is considered Marvel's first Latin American LGBT character to also just star in a comic book series, of her own. So history was made when that character debuted in 2001. It was like Vengeance issue 1 or something like that. But like, how did the character and the creation of the character come about? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, it's when you're working in a shared universe where there's a lot of moving parts and you want to make a contribution, you tend to look at, well, what's missing from this shared universe? What kind of character? Who's not being represented in this universe? You know, in Marvel, that's a lot of ground to cover. But
Yeah, it is.
you know, I was the idea of um, a sort of she was kind of meant to be a cross at first between Wonder Woman and Captain America, you know, and she was meant to be, you know, I mean, her name was to evoke, um, you know, the country she lived in, but in a way that made you think, you know, it's one thing for Captain America, blonde haired, blue eyed white man, to represent America. You know, it's we all understand that trope, but to have different cultures represent America so blatantly had never been done before at Marvel, and I felt like it was time. You know, I felt like, and I you know I live in L.A. I've lived here for 31 years, and when I first moved here, for a while I lived in East Hollywood, which was, you know, that's very East LA is a very Latino kind of community there. So I was exposed to it and got to really kind of see it firsthand. And it just, you know, it's one of those things where you think of something and it just starts to feel right. Like it feels like it already existed, that it should always have existed. And developing that character, she just felt like, yeah, this is Marvel needs this, you know. And listen, I would never put myself up there as any kind of great crusader for diversity. I mean, I believe in it, and I believe it should be there more than it is. But I just thought she was a cool character, you know, from a superhero point of view. You know, a young woman who could kick anybody's ass and had her own opinion about the universe that she lived in. I mean, my favorite line from Vengeance is her saying, "You couldn't pay me to join the Avengers." You know, she was of another generation, you know, that looked at the old institutions with kind of a side eye, which I really liked. I think that you should do that. You should kind of try to tear down the old institutions wherever possible, because either they'll survive and prove their resilience, or they go away and they, you know, it's proven that they should go away. So to
Yeah.
create a character that confronted that system in the Marvel universe, that was to me the appeal of writing that character, creating that character. The the cultural ethnicity of the character and later her sexuality was really to me secondary in terms of she had to work as a character first, and she had to work as something that stood in a unique light in the Marvel universe. So that's where I was coming from, and the fact that she gained that, you know, popularity and momentum, you know, it's like I said, it's really gratifying, and I'm glad that she the audience that she was meant to reflect identified back with her. That was
Mm.
amazing. You know, that was so gratifying that young Latino women were like looking at that character and going, "I see myself in her. I identify with her. You know, I'm going to embrace her as like one of my characters that I'm going to, you know, uh, support, as you know, throughout whatever iteration she shows up in." That was fantastic. One of the great highlights of
Damn.
my career.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great highlight, and I gotta say, I know at least 2 off the top of my head right now, diehard America Chavez fans who were stupid excited to know that, you know, she was gonna be portrayed in the movie. So, on behalf of them, Joe, yeah, you struck lightning with that character there. Um, and I really appreciate you going in depth in terms of your thought process, because I love hearing any time that a writer talks about how a character kind of like brings themselves to light, right? Like figuratively speaking, like, you know, like it's not so much as the writer fleshing them out completely. Like there's some, yeah, I don't know how to explain it, but there's something there that the writer doesn't have to do that much. Where it's like just a little nudge, and the character's kind of informing. It's like a weird relationship between the writer and the character itself. Do any other characters or stories come to mind where it felt effortless? Or in your words, I think you said, it was cool. It was something. It felt good. What else comes to mind when I guess you think of like that feeling?
Well, I mean, that happens with a lot of characters, actually. I mean, in terms of, I mean, it's one thing, again, it's the two categories. It's one where I'm coming in and writing Superman, for instance, and I have to find my Superman voice to feel like I'm writing the character authentically. And that sometimes takes a while. But once I locked into Superman, he wrote himself. What he would say and what he would do became obvious. It was not a lot of effort. I mean, I feel like a writer's job in general, when it comes to character creation or story creation, is you just are there to kind of set the table, try to get all the elements in place, and then see where it takes you. Because good characters that are constructed well, they'll tell you what stories they want to be in, how they're going to react to certain situations, what they're going to say. They tell you. And at that point, you're almost like, as Quentin Tarantino once said, you're like a court reporter. You're just sort of it's like you're taking dictation. When that happens, then you're on the right track. It's when you have to force things that you just feel like, oh man, this is a chore. I'm not getting this. There's something about this that is not hitting. It's as a writer, when that happens, it's torture. It's torture. But luckily, like I said, I've been doing this for a while. I kind of know how to set the table these days. So I think I do. I'm better at setting myself up for success in writing these characters than I was, 25 years ago, for sure.
It's great. Okay. So, Joe, another benefit of interviewing someone like you that has so many years in the game is that I don't know, it's fun sometimes just to see what I've missed out on, right? Where I'm like, oh, you wrote this with this artist? Oh, that's really cool. So I wrote down a list of some names of collaborators and artists that you've worked with. And I kind of want to do this like just a quick strike. I'm gonna name a couple. These are artists that you've worked with. Some of these series I've read, some of them are my favorite artists, etc. So I'm gonna say the name and then whatever comes to mind, whether it be a story, whatever you want to describe their work or whatever, uh, feel free to fire it off. So
Sure.
I'm gonna start off with this name here. I'm gonna start off with Tom Scioli because he was on the podcast last year to promote his Godzilla book that came out. But also, you know, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like he's one of your longest running collaborators in terms of artists. You guys worked on Godland for Image Comics for damn near 7 years. What comes to mind when you think Tom Scioli?
Tom and I, it was like a meeting of the minds. When we got together, it was just sort of instant click in terms of creativity and like the kind of book we wanted to do. And to me, it was just a constant back and forth of like, I have this idea. What do you got? He'd come back with his idea. And it was a game of ping pong in the whole run of Godland. And I'm as proud of that as I am of anything I've ever done. And I'm especially proud that Tom and I stuck through it together. There was never a time, I mean, we had moments, but overall, there was never a time where we each weren't bringing everything that we had to bear on the series. Um, we never slagged off on ideas and trying to push the envelope for ourselves and each other. So, I'm proud of the book, but I'm just as proud of that collaboration.
Well said. I love hearing that. All right, this next one. I'm gonna say Scott Collins, who you worked with at Marvel plenty of times, but particularly on one of my favorite Avengers series, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, the first volume from 2005. What comes to mind for Scott Collins?
Scott, it was great because whenever whenever I write things and I don't know exactly who's going to draw them yet, which is not often, by the way, but it happens, especially at the beginning of a project when I'm just kind of formulating it and figuring it out. When I was doing that Avengers series. Anytime I write the Avengers, in my mind, I'm writing for George Perez because he's my Avengers guy, or John Byrne, who's the other big Avengers guy for me. But when Scott was brought on to that Avengers series, his storytelling to me was the closest at the time to a George Perez in terms of not not backing off on having 8, 9, 10 panels a page, drawing everything, not shortcutting anything. So I felt like, oh, this is great. I can lean into my George Perez fanboy without working with George, which was not. I've never would ever thought that I was going to work with George. He was too high up on in the pantheon for me to even consider it. But Scott brought that same kind of storytelling energy and that sort of unflagging enthusiasm for the page. So that that series turned out even better than I thought it would because he allowed me to indulge in that fantasy of writing for George Perez. So that turned out really great. I was really proud of that series too.
Can I also say that those covers for Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes Volume 1 and 2, those covers are so dope. I mean, just from a design perspective, and I think you had Dave Johnson, I think did the covers for at least the Volume 2. I think Scott Collins did the covers. But I mean, just the way like the font, with the every issue spelled out, I think a letter of Avengers or something to that effect. Like I vividly remember flipping through short boxes as a kid at my first comic shop and being really into Avengers and a big fan of George Perez and finding those issues. And you're right, like Scott Collins, yeah, there's definitely like not too much degrees of separation between Scott Collins and George Perez in my eyes for sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, all right, how about this next name here? Dustin Nguyen, who you worked with on the 2002 Wildcats version 3.0 series from DC Comics. What comes to mind?
Well, Dustin was a newbie when he took on that series. He's only done a couple of things at Wildstorm up until that point. And when they brought him up to me as a possibility, I was like, I don't know, man. I don't know him. I didn't really know his work that well. But they convinced me, and man, I'm glad they did because not only did Dustin level up on that book from page one, he really was a great collaborator. We became great friends and great friends to this day. And so it was one of those instances where an artist was brought to me, and at first I was hesitant, but turned out so great, which is why to this day I keep an open mind. If an editor says, "What about this guy?" I'll look at them. I'll consider because I was hesitant about Dustin, and he knocked it out of the park. And we've done various little things ever since then. But great guy, great friend, and a great artist who's only just gotten better and better and better.
Yeah, he is on a tear. I mean, even his creator owned stuff. Oh my god, I'm drawing a huge blank. It was like a sci-fi epic for
Ascender and
Descender.
Descender.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what? Let's go creator owned here for this last one. And hopefully I don't butcher the name. But speaking about long series and just long time collaborators, what comes to mind when I say Pietro Peter Kowalski? Is that how I say
Yep.
it?
Jim Kowalski.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Who you worked with on the 2013 Sex series for Image Comics, another long run series for you. What comes to mind?
Uh, Great guy, great artist. Again, will draw anything down to the tiniest detail. Doesn't ever take a shortcut. And with sex, we wanted to. It was that was as much a world building exercise as it was about the characters in the story. And he built that world to such a great degree that it felt so lived in from the first issue. That and we have other things coming up down the pike. Sex is not over, which everybody loves to hear that sex is not done yet. But we have other projects that we're working on. Yeah, but there's other projects that we're working on that I think are great.
All right. Well, look, I was going to get into shift top or change topics, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask for an Ian Churchill story, considering I was such a huge Ian Churchill fan growing up. Like, he did a cable. He did a couple cable issues where he fought like crossover of X-Men, and I'm just a big Ian Churchill fan, and considering that you two worked together on a bunch of Uncanny X-Men comics from like the early 2000s, what do you got any good like Ian Churchill stories?
I got a few. I mean, he slept on my couch one night when we were hanging out in LA together, and I don't know if he didn't have anywhere to go, or but he ended up sleeping on my couch in my shitty apartment. I'm sure he was uh, in East Hollywood, so I'm sure he was thinking, well, how did I get here? Because he's just a great guy from England, just a great, very fine Englishman.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't know he was English. Cool.
oh yeah, yeah. Um, we were in New York together for the first X Summit for when we did those that run of issues together, and we all went to. It was me, Ian, Grant Morrison, and Frank Whiteley, and we all went to Times Square to the Virgin Megastore, which used to be in Times Square, and down in the basement was Virgin Books, um, and Ian is a great guy, but he had his taste in comics, and he didn't know who Frank Whiteley was. He'd never really read anything he had done. So I said, "Well, let me show you what what it's about." And then down in the down, and I'm sure that you know, I don't know what Ian was thinking, but we went down to the Virgin bookstore and we found a copy of the Earth 2 graphic novel that Grant and Quietly had done just recently, just before they started on X Men. I said, "Here it is. This is what the stuff looks like." And I just remember, again, I don't know what Ian was expecting, but he was like, "Oh, so this guy's a genius. I see." You know, he just thought he was just another sort of jobber like kind of we were. Uh,
Hmm.
but Quietly's work is, as we all know, is on another level. Uh,
Absolutely.
so seeing that, Ian was like, "And he's doing the other X Men book. Okay, I got to step up." And I think it freaked him out a little bit, but he certainly stepped up. I mean, the work that he did on those issues that he drew for me with me were, I think, some of the best that he's ever done in terms of, again, level of detail, uh, you know, uh, level of storytelling. He I think that seeing Frank Quitely's work kind of lit a little fire under his ass for that X-Men run.
Yeah. Look, this is gonna sound weird to say, but Ian Churchill draws like just really attractive people, like like superheroes, like the like models that happen to have superpowers. There was always something about the way he depicted just regular, like superheroes as like, perfect people, good looking people, muscular, like his action scenes were always really great. He could draw one hell of a splash page. Like I always thinking about those Cable and X-Men issues, like the big action splash pages like definitely come to mind. So
Yeah, and I definitely pushed him out of his comfort zone a little bit because I had a when I came on to Uncanny X-Men, I had a vision for that series, mainly because I was feeling the pressure. I mean, if you think Ian Churchill was feeling the pressure of Frank Quietly on the book, I had the pressure of
Hmm.
Grant Morrison writing the other book. So I was really like, I was like, really, oh my god, there's no, and
Yeah.
there's no way we were going to match up, and we had to go in there swinging,
For sure, for sure. All right, Joe. So sorry, let me take a step back. Joe, I've got one more thing for you. What I like about doing these interviews is the possibility of connecting a creator with the comic shop, And in this case, I reached out to Ben Kingsbury, who owns not only the sponsor of the show, but the comic shop that I frequent, Gotham City Limit. And I asked him to send in a voicemail for you to talk about the upcoming Space Quest series, seeing as he'll be selling those comic books.
Yeah,
So I thought you might want to hear from the source, right?
sure.
So here's Ben Kingsbury.
Hey, Joe, Ben K, representing Gotham City Limit, local comic shop in Jacksonville, Florida. Thanks so much for taking some time to be on this awesome podcast. I just want to say congratulations on writing an awesome comic like Weapon X-Men and then having the privilege of having the original cover art done by none other than Alex Ross. I mean, that cover with Cable, Wolverine, Deadpool, and more is spectacular. I wish I had enough money to buy the original art. However, that's got to be pretty cool feeling to have a legend like Alex Ross do cover art for a comic you write. Then with your Space Ghost and Jonny Quest upcoming comic, having Mark Spears, who might be arguably the hottest comic book artist out there right now, to do the cover art of the A cover of that has to be a privilege as well. So that's where my question comes from. Has there been a comic that you've written where an artist has done the cover art or interiors that you idolized growing up and made you feel like, wow, I really made it? I'm going to get off and let you answer. Thanks again for writing awesome comics. We literally couldn't do it without you. And remember, Short Box Nation, always take it to the limit.
That was Ben Kingsbury of Gotham City Limit. Big shout out to Ben for that question. As you can tell, he's a very energetic, and when it comes to comics, you won't find anyone more hype about comics. And yeah, he's been talking about Mark Spears every single time I get in the shop. I guess like his covers fly off the shelf. So I guess what does it feel like having Mark Spears do the covers for Space Quest and then also his question too?
It's very cool. I mean, it shows that I mean, Dynamite. He's a big gun for Dynamite. When they pull him out, put him on a cover, you know it's a big deal. So I'm grateful that he was able to do this one. In terms of this question, I would have to say I did a series in the late '90s. I only been in the business a couple of years, called X-Men: Children of the Atom, and the artist on that, at least the first 3 issues, was Steve Rude. And
Oh, that is right. I've
yeah,
been looking for those issues like in the wild for a minute. Yeah.
Steve Rude. I mean, when I was a teenager, Nexus was my favorite comic book. I love Steve Rude, and the fact that we worked together at all still blows my mind, because I had this thing about when I broke in, I didn't really want to work with my heroes. I wanted them to remain heroes. I wanted to work with artists that were sort of at my level in the business, because then it would be a balanced collaboration. It wouldn't be one guy having the power over the other guy. It would just be a true collaboration. So, but with Steve Root, I made an exception because was legitimately a hero of mine, and working with him, getting to know him, was amazing and just as fulfilling as you want it to be. He did not disappoint on any level. His work on that series is phenomenal. I think Marvel gave him a bum deal at the time, um, but the time that we had together and the collaboration that we did have together was, I mean, that was a highlight of my early career for sure. And I look back on it now. I mean, that's there was no other answer to that question than Steve Root on Children of the Atom. You know, it was a big deal for
Yeah.
me.
Those are yeah, it was a 3 issue series, and I have been looking for these issues for a minute now because to your point, the Steve Root covers are so badass. I had no idea that you were the writer on that. And Joe, with all due respect, I say this fully respectfully, I feel like that is what was happening as I was doing prep for this. I'm like, "Oh, wait, Joe Casey wrote that? I love that series. Oh, Joe Casey wrote that too? I love that series." So I challenge any comic collector or comic fan worth their spit to go through their collection right now, and I guarantee you, Joe Casey's in one of those short boxes. If he's not in an you could probably fill an entire collection of just the stuff that you've written. And I guess I can go a couple different ways in terms of questions, but Joe, you've been in this industry long enough to where I'm curious to hear your answer. If you could change one thing about like comic books and the way whether they're made or sold, et cetera, like what would you change? Because I've read a couple of recent interviews where you talk about how marketing in comics is kind of like it's a hurdle, it's a headache. Like creators having to really step up and do a lot more when it comes to marketing their own books to help publishers. Like, is that what you would change, or is there something else that comes to mind?
No, that's really my only thing that I would want to fix, I guess. Because we're not, the selling of comics to retailers by the publishers, especially on the Marvel and DC side, it's less about the meritocracy of the work. It's more about some bean counter somewhere decides, okay, we're gonna make money on this as opposed to this. Whatever those metrics are, I'm not privy to them, but they're not necessarily
I don't think.
random.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not random, but they're not necessarily. They're not looking at the work itself and going, this is good work. Let's push this. Let's market this. Let's make people aware of it. But that's only one side of that coin. The other side is there's not really a mechanism in place to get that word out on a really wide level. There is no Wizard magazine that everybody in the industry reads or every retailer read, where you can advertise something or talk about something or get the buzz going on something. There's no central news website that people go to every day like they used to for Newsarama and Comic Book Resources. So those two things are really, I think they're really holding us back, because publishers aren't getting the word out, but at the same time, there's nowhere to get the word out too, you know? So, for creators, we have to get out there as much as we can and, bang the drum about our projects. Even for work like Weapon X-Men, I've been doing a huge push on Weapon X-Men. I don't know why I'd have to do that. It's a book with Cable, Wolverine, and Deadpool. You'd think that Marvel would look at that, and then we're putting our blood, sweat, and tears into that book, and it shows in the final product. I think it's a really good modern superhero book, but whatever its merits are not part of the equation. Whatever its creative merits are not part of the equation of how hard it gets pushed. But again, like I said, where do you push it? There's nowhere. You can't do one interview somewhere that everybody will watch or read or check out. It's just a lot more uh, effort on the part of creators now. And look, I love talking about comics, so I'll talk to anybody and everybody that lines up at my door to talk about comics. But I'd much rather there be effective marketing and effective ways in which to market. It's a very closed system, and I don't think it's going to lead to anywhere good. It's just going to keep the more closed it is, the smaller it gets, and the more it shrinks. And
Yeah.
it's dangerous territory we're in now.
Yeah. Well, I guess in closing, Joe, do you have any advice for any aspiring comic creators that want to do what you do, that want to be the next Joe Casey, that want to have a 20 plus career? A 20 plus career. Like, is there any piece of advice that you wish you would have received when you first started?
Well, I don't know if I needed any. I don't know if I need any advice because it worked out for me with whatever advice I've been given at the time or whatever notion I had about doing it. But what I would say to
Yeah, hard.
somebody coming up is that just make comics. Luckily the technology exists where you can make comics and throw them up on the internet and people will see them. Don't worry about the path to. Don't worry about writing the X-Men. Worry about making comics and writing good comics. The X-Men may be there in your future. They may not be. There might not be an X-Men to write, and at least in terms of a comic book in 5 years. So don't worry about that. Worry about being good at writing comics or making comics if you're an artist. Because there's nothing that will hold you back anymore. There's no gatekeepers to people seeing your work. So just do it. You're never going to regret putting in the time to making your craft better. You'll have no regrets ever in your life for that time you put in. So start now. Put in that time. It will pay off later. I guarantee it.
What do they say? The journey of a thousand steps starts with one step. So
That's right.
well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Ladies and gents, this is the Short Box Podcast, and we just finished talking to Joe Casey about his career, life, and art. Be sure to check out his new project, Space Ghost and Jonny Quest, Space Quest #1, hitting comic shops on Wednesday, March 26th. I'll have links to pre-order the book online, as well as links to follow Joe on social media. Might I go ahead and recommend following Joe on his Substack, which is apparently free and open. I was going through a couple of the articles or posts that you've made. Actually, speaking about Weapon X-Men, I was reading your Substack about that, and you went through like every panel, broke down the inspiration, certain Easter eggs. So, highly recommend following Joe on Substack. Give him a follow. I have links in the show notes. Joe, to go back to your earlier point, I just want to say I appreciate you taking time to promote Space Quest, coming on here talking comics. I know it's not, it's not easy. You've got 24 hours in a day, like I've got 24 hours in the day. So this means a lot that I got to pick your brain and talk comics with you. Do you have any parting words or shameless plugs before we wrap up?
No, I mean, you plug the Substack. That's what I was going to say. It's free, so I can tell everybody you'll get your money's worth. But other than
I
that,
like
yeah,
that.
this was great. Thanks for having me. You run a great show here, and I was happy to be here.